Okay, so we're going to talk Pope Leo.
Yeah.
And other popery stuff.
This is a potpourri episode?
This is the potpourri episode. That'll be perfect. We've not had one before.
Potpourri. Here we go.
All right, here we go. In 3, 2, and 1. I'm Deacon Eric.
And I'm Dr. Brett Salkeld.
And you're listening to Thinking Faith.
This is a podcast brought to you by the Archdiocese of Regina, where we attempt to navigate this winding road of faith in Jesus Christ so that we might know Him more intimately, love Him more profoundly, and together serve Him more deeply in our daily lives.
Welcome, everyone, to another wonderful week of Thinking Faith with my good friend and co-host, Brett, and a new pope.
Habemus Papem!
Habemus Papem. Yeah.
So we hardly have a plan at all, but we're just going to talk about having a pope.
No, because that's like, regardless of what plans we had for podcasts before.
Yeah, we had some other things we were going to talk about.
Get a new pope and everything.
It's Pope o'clock.
Yeah. And so behind the scenes, we actually had planned to record a different episode on the day that we got our new pope. And it was literally like minutes before.
Well, we're going to do something on AI.
We were.
Well, that's coming.
So it's interesting.
And actually, there's overlap with the Pope. But
yeah.
So we'll touch on that.
We were about to do that. And yeah, the white smoke started coming. And that just, as in communications, that just put the rest of the week kind of sideways.
So if you listen to last week's episode, which is coming out tomorrow.
For us, it's coming out tomorrow.
Tomorrow, but for you a week ago.
Yeah.
Anyways, at the end of that episode, we put money down on Pope names.
Yeah. Like fake money.
Fake money.
Yeah.
Actually, wasn't it years in purgatory? Anyway.
It was years in purgatory. Anyways. Yeah, because that always works out well for Catholics.
And now no one wants to live with me.
Yeah. No. It is. Yeah. As soon as the good cardinal came out of the balcony and started, like, even though it was in Latin, I heard it right away. And I'm just like, no. Say it isn't so.
This can't be right.
How are we going to live with this guy? Yeah. So the Pope Leo XIV.
So here's the trick. I guessed right.
So yeah. So tell us the trick.
Right. So
here's the trick in guessing the right.
So people keep asking me what's the trick, and here's the thing. In retrospect, your mind thinks it did certain things, but there's actually video evidence of the first thing I did, and I don't remember exactly what happened then. So I'm going to reconstruct something, but it's something like this. When we first asked, I was like, I think it was sort of like, I don't know. Give me a name. Like it was pretty.
That's pretty much where I was.
Right?
I was like, okay, I just got to pick a name, and what name is.
So I didn't have a strong argument laid out, but after, and this is how our brains work, right? Once you've got something to grab onto, then you start reasoning towards it. So I had other conversations since then where I like doubled down. I was like, no. I went with Leo early, and then I was like, now I need a good reason for Leo. And I started developing it. And I actually had a conversation on my other podcast, the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. Before I went live with the guest, we were talking about Pope names and whatever. And I said Leo XIV, and I had a more developed reason than I had here. And then when I got it right, then you're like, wow, was I ever, how
now all I really need to
all these things. So here's here's what I think is true about my initial guess. And then we can walk through a little more. My initial guess was a sort of walk backwards through the names and see what's available. And so I'm like, nobody in their right mind wants to be Francis II, Benedict XVII, or John Paul III.
Yes.
You don't want your, papacy judged against someone in living memory in that kind of explicit kind of way, right?
Yeah.
So I think you just, for the same reason Francis didn't want to be John Paul or Benedict, and Benedict didn't want to be John Paul III and whatever. Now, John Paul II, there's a different reason why he would choose John Paul II after John Paul I.
Yeah.
Because he saw himself as having essentially the same task as a guy who never got a chance to put his stamp on it, right?
Exactly.
But not since Pius XII have we had someone who's like, I follow in the footsteps of the last guy. His program is my program. We had Pius XI and the 12th. So I'm walking backwards through the names. I'm like, Francis, Benedict, and John Paul are off the table.
Yeah.
I feel like John and Paul are still not in range. Like there's still too much within
close.
living memory, right? That puts you back to Pius. And my sense is like, okay, there's the controversy with Pius XII and the Jews, and did he do enough, and was his approach the right one or not, which kind of taints the question. But I think more than that, there's this block of Piuses from like 9, 10, 11, 12 that are sort of stand-in for the preconciliar church. Like that's just the name of a preconciliar pope is Pius. Yeah. And so to choose Pius XIII at this stage in history is almost a declaration against Vatican II, even though that wouldn't be fair to Pius XII or anything. I think that's just what the name means in the Catholic imagination. So I think Pius is not allowed for like another 50 years. No one's allowed to pick Pius. So
here's another prediction.
Right. You watch.
Our younger audience can keep track of, because we know our audience keeps track of all this stuff for us. Yeah.
Keep walking back. Well, the next, who's available within this run of Piuses? Well, Benedict XV, but that was already taken. That was the move that the last or two popes ago pulled, right? Yeah. So what's left? Well, the next in the line is, and now I'm not even super confident that there wasn't someone else in there, but in my mind, at least, the next in the line is Leo. So that's the first move, is like, just walk back and see what's available. And then you say, okay, so who is Leo XIII?
Yeah.
And two things stood out for me personally. I've learned more since, but two things, and I don't remember if I said this last week here or if I said it elsewhere. The first thing is Rerum Novarum. So the first encyclical that launches the tradition of papal encyclicals on Catholic social teaching.
I think we did
touch on that?
Yeah.
So that's what he's most known for is, and so to such a degree that subsequent encyclicals get named with reference to it.
Yeah.
So on the 40th anniversary, it says 40 years ago we did this. On the 80th, they say, and then on the 100th, Centesimus Annus, John Paul II. So it's so seminal that others get released on its anniversary. So it's a big deal. So that was one, is Rerum Novarum. And I want to talk a little more about Rerum Novarum in a second. But the second one for me, this is a little personal thing, there's my buddy, is Leo XIII gave Thomistic philosophy pride of place in seminary formation.
Okay.
And so those were the two things that I knew about Leo XIII without having much expertise in that era of church history or anything, was Rerum Novarum and Thomas Aquinas, both of which I'm like, okay, well, both of those can work. And Rerum Novarum in particular, because Rerum Novarum is written in response to the Industrial Revolution. So advances in technology, changes in economics, social and political life that follow from these things are shaking the world at that time.
At that particular time.
And Leo writes Rerum Novarum and starts the Catholic social teaching encyclical tradition in light of these upheavals in mostly European society, right?
But upheavals that he's going to see, he could already see spilling over into the global culture.
And so I'm thinking, if I'm the Pope, if I'm the new Pope, and I'm looking around and saying, are we in the middle of a comparable, analogous kind of situation where new technologies, new developments are shaping labor, society, politics, economics, whatever.
Our concept of the human person.
Right? Like, and so that made me think, that lands. And then Leo now has been talking about this, and here's the quote.
He's fully said now.
I chose to take the name Leo XIV. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. So
full on.
And
honestly, in the days since, because we've only had a new pope for a few days at this point of recording, it makes more and more sense. Right. In the context. And when you start getting an appreciation, a deeper appreciation for what Leo XIII did, at that time, you can see the correlation.
Right.
And it makes me very excited to see, like we did talk about in the last episode, what his first encyclical is going to be. That's going to, especially now with stuff like this coming up.
And from other things he said, because now I'm gone back and like listened to interviews he gave before he was even a cardinal. And he has been a very perceptive observer of social media, AI, these kinds of things. He's already, he's an Augustinian, and he is drawing on Augustine's City of God, where Augustine was keenly aware as a rhetorician, right? As a person who knows how to communicate to the audience, in City of God in particular, Augustine is very keen to recognize the ways in which, you might even say the demons, certainly the powers of this world, right? The political powers of this world, frame things for people's consumption. So one of the things that, a quote I read in one of the things he said is, the media doesn't just tell us what to think, it tells us what to think about. And that's a deep Augustinian insight that has roots in things like City of God, that sort of. So I'm curious to see where Aquinas shows up, if he does. But a third thing, which I didn't know about Leo, but when I was talking to this other guest, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska, who I was interviewing on my other podcast, I said, I think Leo XIV, and she said, which I didn't know, that he's the Rosary Pope.
Yes.
He wrote 11 encyclicals.
Rosary Pope and the St. Michael's Prayer
And
Pope.
the St. Michael Prayer.
Yeah.
So I said, well, that's interesting. Now, since his election, Leo XIV has said some very interesting things about the value of popular piety. One of which was so fascinating, I wish I had the quote in front of me so we could really parse it, but it was something like, he was talking about inclusivity, which is like a buzzword for sort of one side of the political, well, it's a buzzword for both, but it means something good on one side of the political spectrum or something bad on the other. So if the Pope talks about inclusivity, it's like, oh, shoot. Or, oh, yay, he's on our team.
Or just even which side is he talking to here? In this moment, right?
But then he made this brilliant, where he talked about popular piety as this deeply inclusive practice. Now, if you live in suburban North America, where we live and where a lot of our audience lives, that might not be immediately obvious why that connection is there. But if you've served for a few decades in poor parts of Latin America, all of a sudden, right, places where the debates that obsess us, you know, if we think about Caridia Amazonia, for instance, and like the West's obsession with the question of female deacons, and then the people in the Amazon are like, we'd love it if you weren't burning down our forests, right? Like, right? Like, which questions are at the forefront of the mind? Popular piety as an inclusive practice for the church, when you're talking not about Western categories of who's in and who's out, but you're talking actually really about the poor. Makes a lot more sense. So anyway, so the Rosary and the St. Michael Prayer from Leo XIII, and popular piety as an emphasis, as a emerging emphasis for Leo XIV. Rerum Novarum and the social teaching tradition, and now the new context with AI. He's young and healthy. This will be the Pope who is at the forefront for the church's thinking about AI, transhumanism, all these kinds of things. And Leo XIII's legacy actually plays pretty well into that. So
what I think is interesting too is mixing in this Augustinian spirituality. Right. We saw Pope Francis, who brought together his concerns for the environment and ecology and seeing the interconnectedness between those and most other aspects of our church's social teaching and that. But he brought that together with his Ignatian spirituality. Right. This whole synod on synodality is Ignatian spiritual conversation and discernment. Right. On a global scale. That he brought to play. So it'll be interesting to see how Leo XIV takes all of this from his namesake, and then combines that or creates a synthesis with his Augustinian spirituality. And we've seen, I mean, right from his opening address, after like the whole theme was on peace and unity. Right.
His Episcopal motto.
That's right. About unity. I was just going to say, right? Yeah. And in the one, we are one. right? I think that's how it goes. Yeah. In the one, we are one.
Something very much like that. Anyways.
Something very much. Yeah. For that. And he's in the subsequent days, he's spoken very specifically about the need for a focus on peace and unity,
right?
Which is one of the hallmarks of Augustinian spirituality,
right?
And that's something I've been digging into over the last little bit.
Okay, we're gonna have to learn now. So we had a decade of Ignatian.
Like, what does this mean? What do we expect? I didn't know, for example, that the portions of the Rule of Saint Benedict, which I've often turned to, looking at themes of like welcoming and hospitality, and stuff in community, is just a small portion of a larger piece that Saint Augustine included in his rule.
Okay.
For essentially clergy living in his diocese at the time in Hippo.
Okay.
And that. So speaking a lot about the ways that we discover our unity lived within community.
Okay.
And that. So I think that'll be really interesting.
And that, if you think about his opening address, like, we are together as disciples of Christ, like unity. Yeah.
He spoke was it yesterday or the day before, to journalists.
Yes, I saw that.
Basically saying, look, we need to be careful of our language, and we need to not use divisive, hate-filled language.
Right.
But that we have a power in our words to foster the unity and the peace that our hearts long for.
Right.
Like, yeah.
So I like the word you said, synthesis, right? So so early indications are he's using the language of Francis's program, right? Emphasis on collegiality and synodality was one of the things in a list of priorities he made.
And that was another thing he made sure to mention right out of the gate.
Right. And he prays at Francis's tomb, and he speaks lovingly of Francis in his opening address. But already you can tell the Leonine angle is going to be slightly different.
Yeah.
This was fascinating for me. So I watched CBC's coverage of the address to journalists today.
Okay.
And now I don't know if this is how much this would hold up if you went and read the actual texts.
Yeah.
But this reporter's impression was, in Francis's first address to journalists, he kind of gave them a scolding.
Yeah.
And was concerned that their coverage of the church isn't always fair.
Yeah.
And I mean, we work in a church office. We know that Francis isn't wrong.
Yeah.
Like, this happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
But Leo's lead was, we need journalists with integrity because of, and you know, what are the situations in the world? He talked particularly about journalists in war zones.
Yeah.
He called for the release of captive journalists. So he told the journalists how valuable he sees their task as being, and that he wants them on the team, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they received him very warmly. And my general sense is, so this is just one example of a general sense. My general sense is Leo is really good at reading a room.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone has said he's a good listener. People who know him in the interviews, that's one of the first things they talk about. Good listener. He's really good at reading a room, and then letting the people in the room know that he sees them.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's one example that this is my interpretation of one thing that could be interpreted in a bunch of ways, right? So he wore the mozzetta.
Yeah.
Right. So he comes out in red, like Benedict and John Paul and numerous other popes before. And Francis came out just in white. Right. So Francis is trying to make one point, right? He's trying to make a point about simplicity and humility. Right. Then the next guy is now in a bit of a bind. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you either do what Benedict did, or you do what Francis did.
Yeah.
Or you do something else completely different. I don't know what that would be.
Do you carry on with tradition, pick it up, or do you accept that Francis began a new tradition?
Right, because now how it's going to get read is as support of one program or another.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky spot to be in.
Yeah.
So Leo wears the thing. Yeah. When asked about why he wore it, gives a completely non-political answer. No idea. He goes, because red is symbolic of sacrifice.
Yeah.
Which is why they've had the red thing forever.
Exactly.
That's why it's there. But he doesn't say because I'm aligned with this or against that or like nothing. right? Just because red means this. And I think I love that he can duck the preconceived political notion that accompanies anyone in a position like that. Not guaranteed that he ducks it every time, but I thought that was a nimble kind of a thing. And relatedly, I think the red says to the traditionalists, not I'm one of yours on the inside or anything like that. And now we're
not like a subtle wink to the
we're going back and like Francis is over, and because everything else he said doesn't go in that way.
Exactly.
But what I think it says is I see you.
Yeah.
I think it says I see you and you don't need to panic. Let's just
Well, I think that's another area of division that we've been contending with in an increasing way within
absolutely.
the church. And especially in his after 40 years outside of the US, it's still your home space. And there's been huge divisions growing in the American church.
He's been engaged with his friends and family on social media, so he's not unaware. He watches American news. Like
that's it.
He's a citizen of the world in a sense.
Yeah.
But he's not unaware of the situation in the United States.
Yeah. And I would say that's the US, I think, gets amplified because of its presence in media and
because of the amount of money it has.
Exactly.
And there's lots of reasons, right?
But it's indicative of a larger divide.
Right. Yeah.
Within the church. And so to see again, right out of the hop, efforts to start sowing seeds of peace.
Right.
Within those, it'd be interesting to see how that progresses and how that grows.
Right.
Over the next while. I was, just even over the weekend, I was thinking of all the podcasts we did during COVID over polarization and conspiracy thinking that drives polarization and those kinds of things. And I'm finding myself wondering, so what is Pope Leo XIV how is he going to speak into that? Right. Because it hasn't gone away. It's increased in its veracity. Right. Over time. And I think that'll be an interesting space to see him bring.
Early indications. So I just read a few things that he's written or interviews he's given.
Yeah.
Early indications for me is this guy's got some insight on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's seeing pretty clearly.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. He did it in his first homily too.
Yes.
He makes reference back to the fathers of the church. He articulates something from the tradition, often Augustine, but not only Augustine.
Yeah.
About what they knew and understood in their context and the lesson that has for us for today. And he's done it like with great skill. I've been super impressed with that. So I'm looking forward to learning from him on those kinds of things.
Now, how many popes have we had? Because this now makes me wonder. How many popes have we had associated with specific religious orders?
I don't know the answer to that. We know this is the first Jesuit, the first Augustinian.
Yeah.
But how many?
So have we had like
Dominican or Franciscan or Benedict?
Yeah.
Yeah. There have been. Well, yeah, there have been, but I don't have a list.
But because they seem to carry a different sensibility.
Right. Well, so it wasn't common for a while. I think it was more common earlier, but I'd have to double check.
Yeah, it makes me curious about that.
Yeah, that might be
a rabbit hole I haven't dug down yet.
Right. No, it is interesting though.
Yeah.
Let me ask you. So this is an interesting angle.
Okay.
We didn't talk about this, but an American pope.
Yeah.
So I had actually read an article about Prevost. It was an article that said something like, there seems to be, and it was about a week before the election, there seems to be a concerted effort to put this guy's name out because he's shown up in other media places. So I was like, well, and it was borderline conspiratorial.
Yeah.
And then it was like
little echoes of that. Yeah.
And then it was like, not to be conspiratorial, but isn't it odd that he shows up in this paper in the UK and this paper in the United States? And it was from a more conservative outlet that was worried that he's a bit of a compromise candidate and he's maybe a little too lefty or whatever. That was kind of the angle. But anyways, the point is that I had read this article that had said this guy's getting some buzz. And so I was aware of him. If you would have said it's an American, who is it? That would have been the name at the top of my list only because I happened across this one article and then did a little digging. But the general consensus seemed to be that this guy came out of nowhere, which I think when we learn more about the history, that's...
Yeah, not so much out of nowhere, but I would say that prior to last Thursday, most Catholics would not have heard.
No, everyone was talking Paroline and Tagle and maybe Erdo as an outside, like, conservative candidate or something.
You saw him on lists, but even then, you're like, so even if you said, so who's in charge of the dicastery of bishops?
Right, people don't know.
Nobody would
know
who that was, right?
So, apparently, this is all wild speculation, right?
Yeah.
But apparently 2 key figures in mobilizing votes for him were Maradiaga, who was one of Francis's Council of 8.
Yes.
So the Latin America, he's well respected among a lot of the Latin American bishops. So that would have been one major voting bloc.
Yeah.
But the other is Christophe Pierre, who is the papal nuncio to the United States.
Yeah. Okay.
And apparently he was floating this name among the Americans. So what happened with the Europeans, I don't know, but among the Latin Americans and the Americans, there seemed to have been sort of a chief who was promoting Prevost as a possibility in those spheres. Again, wild speculation, who knows?
Yeah.
But it's not, it's plausible. Someone promoted something if the guy got elected.
The interesting thing to me was I did not hear anybody, including myself, seriously considering an American pope, an American-born pope, right? In that sense. Because once you spend, 40 years of your life in a religious order and missionary work and stuff, you have a different outlook than someone who's like spent their whole lives.
Who's the Cardinal Archbishop of New York or Chicago.
Right? I think if somebody was saying to me over the weekend, like, so what do you think about having an American pope? And I said, well, he's American born, but he's not too American.
Well, some people have been saying the least American of the American cardinals or whatever, right?
Same kind of idea.
And you know what people mean by that? They're like, to just take a slight sidetrack. This guy's language skills look very impressive.
Yeah.
And Italian, English, and Spanish, basically flawless. His Latin was really good. Apparently he speaks Incan.
Yes, I did see that too.
And his Portuguese and German and French, I guess, are not bad. This is
very interesting. This is some of the stuff that even Melissa and I were talking about over the weekend and that too. Having a pope who you understand very clearly.
This is very weird.
Very weird.
It's super weird to hear the Pope sound like he could be your uncle.
I think that's part of it, right? For those of us in the North American context,
right.
And I would even like Western Europe and that too. But especially in having a Pope who grew up in a very similar context to us. Even like, okay, so we're Canada and US, but somebody said over the weekend, I think actually it was Mark Shea, who we've had on the show before.
Okay.
He made a comment on Saturday morning saying, he's not much older than me, and you can bet that our new Pope grew up watching Bugs Bunny on Saturday mornings with the rest of us.
On The Daily Show, the host on The Daily Show said it's super weird to have a Pope who can probably sing the Chili's Baby Back Ribs.
Yes. Right? So it's those kinds of like popular cultural aspects that are part of a shared experience that we've not had before.
He's a White Sox fan. That's been the single biggest, cultural shared experience is like, who's this baseball team, right?
Yeah.
But an American Pope, it was not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to have an American Pope.
Mm-hmm.
And now the reason we got this American Pope when you're not supposed to get American Popes is because he doesn't check some of the boxes that you would typically expect of an American cardinal.
Yeah.
But I think actually, at least in hindsight, having an American Pope makes a lot of sense in our current cultural, global, socio-political context, because every single country in the world right now, so we're not in the States, we're in Canada. You watch the national news in Canada, every night, it's about the American president.
Yeah.
And we're not the only country in the world who's, I'm sure in China, the news talks a lot about, everyone is in a new situation vis-a-vis the United States right now.
Yeah.
In a way that it's dominating every local context's discourse, our jobs, our trade, our security, all of these dominoes, right?
Yeah.
And so now you have, the theory was the president of the United States is the most powerful man in the world. The Pope is the highest spiritual office in the world. You can't have both of them from the same country because it's too much power in one place. Because that construction imagines that they're allied, that they're pushing the same agenda, right?
Yeah.
And when you flip it and you go, hold on, but what if there was an American Pope who could be a mirror that got held up to that administration and its policies and that could challenge them? Well, then instead of having, there's too much power in one place, now you have, well, this is the one place they can stand up and say something.
Yeah. Someone from the same family able to speak to the head of that family.
Right.
In a particular way. Yeah. I think in terms even of like David and Nathan.
Okay.
His prophet, right?
Right.
That was Nathan's job.
Right.
To stand up to the king and say, look, we're in the same family here.
Right.
And
Pope Nathan would have been a heck of a name choice.
That would have sent
that
a
would have
message.
Been a little too sharp.
That would have been quite a sharp message, right? But because Nathan's the one that stood up and said, hey, like this thing you did with Uriah, not good.
Right.
Very not good. You should be ashamed of yourself. And boldly proclaiming that critical word, right? And we've seen again in subsequent days some of that critique coming out of
Leo's Twitter feed and stuff like that, right? Yeah. So he's criticized, particularly on immigration.
Yeah.
Or deportation.
I know that was a question my daughter had right away when she texted me on Thursday, and she's like, "So what does this mean? Like, does this mean America just gets the church's support for all the stuff that it's doing and stuff?" And I'm like, this guy spent 40 years like living in South America with the very people that are being shipped out of the country right now. Right.
Like, he speaks their language.
If this was, because I think it was like what's a friend of hers was suspecting about like some of that bribery and conspiracy theory stuff. And I'm like,
Trump bought himself a pope.
Right. Exactly. Right. That kind of thing. And I'm like, if they thought they were doing that, they made the wrong call. Right. Because this guy's been walking with the very people who are suffering from some of those policies right now. Right. And their family members and that.
And so I think that was probably a significant reason why he got significant votes, right? Is that here's a guy who can stand up. Now, interestingly, we've learned his voting, he voted in Republican primaries. Yeah. Right. So he's not, this gives you, right, the only Nixon can go to China kind of logic, right?
Yeah.
He can critique because he's not actually, even in his political registration or his previous voting activity, the enemy.
Yeah.
Right. And so he can stand with a little more credibility as someone who voted in Republican primaries, that it's not just ideological. It's not just his political enemy. It gives him a little more face to say, I'm just preaching the gospel here. This isn't politics, right? So I mean, of course, it has political implications. You know what I mean?
No, and I get all of that, and I've been kind of processing that over these last few days, and yet, would that have been enough? Because this is a very contextual like set of reasons,
right,
that aren't always going to exist, right?
Right.
So you have maybe a whole host of these reasons in the College of Cardinals on why it makes sense at this point in history, but they're electing someone who conceivably will be Pope for like 20 years.
Well, yeah, he should outlive Trump by a bit.
Right. And so does that, like, do you bring the contextual question? How does that fit with the long-term vision that they may have had?
I mean, it can't be the reason.
Yeah.
It has to be like, oh, this guy's great for a bunch of reasons. We think he has these gifts to bring to the church. Oh, and
that's what I think. I think it's more of here's a whole host of reasons why this makes sense.
Right.
For the church in general. And there's a particular situation right now.
Yeah.
That he is maybe uniquely suited for.
Right.
Yeah. That I think makes a lot more sense.
I can't see that it's not Mark Carney.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, we're going to put you in for like a couple years to deal with this guy.
Yeah.
And, I think Rod Dreher said something about it looks like the Cardinals had a Mark Carney election.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I mean, I think he's probably right to the degree that Trump was on their minds in there.
Yeah.
And they needed someone who could speak in that context. And it looks like Leo is well suited to that task. But it's not the same, like you're going into a negotiation like the week after the election to get this particular issue sorted with this guy. And then like, if you do good at that, then you can just retire and chill out. Right. Like that's not
the kind of thing.
Like it's a bigger job than that.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I think in terms of, the church itself has a longer vision in general, and the Holy Spirit in particular has a different vision for our church and our needs. And that's part of what I'm always curious to see how this unfolds.
But then you also say if someone is well suited to that task, they should be well suited to a few tasks that are like,
well, in a few other areas where there are divisions and polarities and that, right? I mean, he's already spoken very specifically to the India-Pakistan conflict.
I didn't see that.
Yes. He called them over the weekend. He called them specifically they entered into a temporary ceasefire, which he thanked them for, and said, now you need to use this space to come to a lasting peace.
Okay. Did he talk to them, or did he...
This was a public address. I don't think. I don't know if there's been conversations behind the scenes, right?
But what you're referring to is a public address, not a phone call to somebody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe he picks up Francis's tradition of like just calling people at home.
Right. Yeah. Hey, this is Pope Bob.
Yeah.
I love that Bob. That's just so great.
Yeah, that's another thing. They were interviewing his brother, right, on the news over the weekend, and he's talking about Bob.
Right.
And we have a pope who grew up being called Bob.
I worked backwards in my head, and I was like, okay, Robert, it's a normal name, just like George.
Yeah.
And Joe and Chuck, right? Like Carol Wojtyła, that's Charles, right? I was like, we don't notice because it's in Polish, but he's acting like Chuck.
So this is another unique like insight that we get that other parts of the world have had.
Right.
Yeah, at least in our memory.
Yeah. Anyways, that was a little bit of a sidelight, but
we didn't get a Pope Pizza Balla though. So
everyone was like,
that was and he could have picked John.
Right.
Yeah, so we'd have Papa John. Pizza. You never heard that one?
No, I did not.
We were so close. I don't think we were that close, but yeah.
But no, so the American angle, right? So both Trump and Leo have said like we're gonna talk soon. So that's an interesting, to see how that goes after the various criticism. I mean, this is going to be a really interesting dynamic.
And I know like high on Pope Leo's radar is fostering a lasting peace in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, right? And I mean, and the U.S. has kind of inserted itself as kind of the hopeful peacemaker between the two. It's interesting that real steps towards peace haven't really like taken root until after like there was that famous shot of Trump and Zelensky sitting down
at Francis's funeral,
right? And then all of a sudden, there's, I mean, at least it seems to me there was a shift in the messaging, at least, and in the stance around the possibility of peace.
Well, I think it was basically like in the lead up to the election, Trump was like, "Don't worry, Putin." I should be, because they're both Vlad, but Putin is like, that people say he can't be trusted, and they're like, "Well, it wasn't with me."
Yeah.
Right. He's like, I have a personal relationship. He'll do what, if he says to me that he's going to do it, he'll do it. That was kind of the move, and then that just never materialized.
Exactly.
And it seems to me that at Francis's funeral, what became clear in this conversation with Zelensky is that, your special relationship that you may or may not have had, but that you thought you had, doesn't mean that Putin stops behaving like Putin.
Yeah.
And you could see it in the tweet that Trump sent on the flight home that maybe he's getting strung along here a bit. And I mean, that's a big breakthrough, you know.
It is.
And for Trump, however, sort of tacitly to acknowledge that his angle wasn't working.
Yeah. That doesn't happen over like
that's not a common yeah. So anyways, so it'll be interesting to see how Leo
and that was another area of global conflict that Leo has spoken into, specifically saying like you need to work towards a lasting long-term peace agreement. And just I want to say maybe 48 hours after that statement, then Russia comes out saying we need to work towards some form of lasting peace in this area. We can't continue doing this, which 2 weeks ago, I never would have called.
Well, it will be interesting to find out what the backroom conversations were, if there was the connection there, because that's moving pretty quick. But
it does, right? And we know so yeah, you start to wonder like what could be going on in the background and stuff. And we know that John Paul II worked both in the foreground, speaking against communism, but also was instrumental in the background, in moving things in a way that resulted in, you know, the fall of the communist state.
Right. Well, so here's hoping. Who knows? But so last week, did we talk about peace? I think we did.
Yeah.
You don't need a crystal ball.
No.
To know a pope is going to, but
that is, right? Because what you do is you look at what is the greatest need in the particular
threat and the
context
culture,
right?
And all that kind of stuff.
And that, which is what is on the minds of the cardinals going into a conclave. Right. And that, so.
Let me finish by telling just a delightful story.
Okay.
Martha is 5.
Yeah.
She loves Pope Leo.
That's awesome.
So we went home that day, right?
Yeah.
That we saw the white smoke, and I told the kids, you know, and they had greater or lesser awareness of the fact that a pope had been elected that day. Okay. But we learned about, you know, black smoke and white smoke and conclaves and cardinal electors, and you know, we learned all this kind of stuff, and we learned where Leo's from and all these kinds of things. But we watched the opening address, which is not in English, right? Martha is just transfixed, and it's like a stodgy, not super accurate English translator over top. Like it's not exciting if you're not already all in.
Yeah.
Martha was like, Martha had to go to the bathroom. She's like, can you pause it so I can go to the bathroom?
Oh my gosh.
Then they're watching Bluey, and Daisy asked if they wanted to switch to maybe Ben and Holly. So this other kids show. And Martha's like, no, can we watch more Pope stuff?
More Pope Leo.
So they've been watching like Pope Leo stuff on YouTube, and it's not kids programming. Like this is boring news, you know, people speaking in a different language, like, and Martha's just like, Leo's her guy.
I have to say, these last 2 weeks for our daughter and her husband who hasn't really had a faith practice,
right?
And that in his life, they have been very intrigued and lots of questions around the whole process of transition, but in particular, very, not really infatuated, but very intrigued by Pope Leo.
Right.
And that. So it'll be interesting to see. We had a Francis effect.
Right.
Be interested to see if we end up with a Leo effect.
Well, here's something gosh, my memory is so bad. I don't know what we talked about last week.
No.
But we did say at one point that age is an interesting factor to consider.
We did. Yeah.
And we got a youngish pope.
Yeah.
Right. So we're looking at
close to the youngest that we might have gotten. Like I think the age range started at 67.
And he was 69.
And he's 69.
Right. So, we're talking about cardinals.
Yeah.
Right.
Of cardinals.
Because theoretically, they could have elected you or me.
They could have. Yeah.
Seems improbable. But anyways. But yeah. So
we had that question with our conquest.
So a very young pope, relatively speaking. So we're looking at 15 to 20 years with this guy, barring some unforeseen tragedy.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting decision. It means there was significant confidence here. I mean, presumably you get that. Anyways, if you got to get 2/3 of cardinal electors, but like to elect someone young is to say like, we're in it for the long haul. So that's an interesting, like I'm saying to my kids, like this will be the Pope who's Pope when you start your families, or if you have a vocation when that's, or like religious vocation, like this will be the Pope that will be the Pope you remember for a lot of your formative years, right? Yeah. First Pope who's younger than my parents.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you think about that, you know, that he could outlive, this is the first Pope that people my parents' generation are thinking, this guy could outlive me.
Yeah.
Right. We always expect to outlive popes. You know, so I mean, it's, you know, we're looking at 15, 20 years. This
is the guy who will, Melissa reminded me of this on the weekend. This is the Pope who will have signed our 40th anniversary papal blessing.
Oh, you're already getting the paperwork ready, hey?
Yeah, she's already got that on her radar.
Right.
Yeah.
But my hope, my biggest hope for this is, and it seems to be a clear priority of his, is unity within the church.
Mm-hmm.
The polarization affecting both the culture and the church is devastating.
Yeah.
It weighs on me a lot.
Yeah.
It hampers the church's mission. And I'm really hopeful. And what especially his capacity as a listener and just his subtle shifts, right? He's not abandoning Pope Francis's program, but there are subtle shifts in emphasis, shifts in language.
Which you would expect.
You would expect.
That's
you don't expect a carbon copy.
Yeah.
I feel like he's seeing some things on that front, on the front of unity, clearly that I really hope for. Of course, there has been some panicked social media responses by people whose job it is to give panicked media responses, right? And they have
which is a good thing, actually, for us to always keep in mind.
Right.
That there are individuals in media positions, and whether that's established media institutions or social media, whose job it is specifically to foster that.
Right. That's how you keep eyes on the screen, right?
Yeah.
And so there have been some outside, on the fringes, some panic sort of stuff from people whose economic model is to keep their audience in a state of constant anxiety.
Yeah.
And so that's what they have to do.
Yeah.
But by and large, if you abstract from that reality, by and large, across the spectrum, I've seen some on the range of like enthusiasm to like cautious optimism. And
I'd say that tracks with what I've been aware of.
Yeah. And I hope that augurs well for the unity of the church, because to me that's, and an American, I think in a certain sense, is aware of kind of the epicenter of these divisions, and can maybe speak to them in a particular way. And so I'm really hopeful on that.
Yeah,
front.
it'll be interesting. Again, I think that brings us right back to the curiosity around the themes in his first encyclical.
Yeah.
Right. I think we will see very social justice related, human dignity, the plight of workers, economics,
social justice in the way that the church has traditionally talked about social justice.
Exactly. Right. But just into this, what does this look like now in the context that we're living in currently? Right. And so artificial intelligence, right? Social media, and I would not be surprised if there was a strong thread of like peace and unity and bringing together and healing divisions.
Yeah.
Right. That kind of stuff. So I don't know what you would call that encyclical.
Right.
But I'm not going to get into a bet with you.
About the title, a title and encyclical. Well, it's a little tougher when you just could pick any Latin words at all, rather than like there's actually a set of names and you just pick the next Roman numeral to stick at the end of the name. So
exactly,
I don't think I've got a real shot at predicting encyclical names.
But that's what we're waiting for now. Yeah, with bated breath. What's his next encyclical?
First encyclical
and Sunday audiences. Sunday audiences, to see.
Well, the homily he gives on his first, like he's done his first mass, but the big like papal installation mass.
Yes, yeah.
I'm sure it's not even called that, but whatever it's called.
Yeah.
the homily on that mass will.
Yeah, that will be good.
And that will be out by the time you hear this.
It will be. Yeah. And because those weekly audiences have traditionally, at least since John Paul II, been the seeds of teaching down the road. Right. I mean, John Paul II's whole theology of the body grew out of those weekly audiences. Right. And stuff. So even paying attention to some of that over the next little while might give us some insight.
We'll see. And then we'll check in 10 years and 20 years and see if anything that we predicted came true.
If we're still around.
I'm still hoping to outlive this Pope.
That's right. Even I mean, if the podcast is still around, who knows? I mean, we've been doing this for almost 10 years. Yeah. Almost the whole papacy of Francis.
That's interesting.
Yeah. We did. Yeah. Amazing. So we'll see how long
we'll see if we make it through one more Pope.
We'll see if we can make it through one more Pope.
All right.
See if our viewers and listeners can make it through
one more Pope. If podcasts are even a thing.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. But we are glad that you joined us here this week on Thinking Faith. Always great conversations. We were talking before, even if everything fails and nothing gets recorded.
Because Braden was walking out going, is it turned on? Is it recording?
Yeah. And then he comes back in. Oh, no, I'm sure it's recording. Yeah. So it was still a good conversation.
There you go.
Yeah. And as always, we continue to pray that God may bless you and those you love with a faith that is always seeking understanding.
St. Thomas and St. Ignatius, and why not for today, St. Augustine?
Pray for us.
Amen.
Amen.